Sometimes life puts you at a crossroads where doing what's right might cost you everything you hold dear. That's exactly what happened to Elias Cutter, a mountain man living alone in the Colorado wilderness, when he found a dying Apache girl on his doorstep. She had a bullet wound in her side and couldn't speak, but her eyes begged for help. Elias, a former Union scout, brought her inside his cabin and spent the night nursing her back to health. When morning came, he walked outside to find 100 Apache warriors waiting in silence around his home. The girl he saved was the chief's daughter. Now this lone mountain man faced an impossible choice between two worlds ready for war. Would his single act of mercy cost him everything, or forge an unlikely bridge between two worlds at war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 24 hours earlier, the morning mist still clung to the pine branches like ghostly fingers when Elias Cutter stepped out of his log cabin to check his trap lines. The Colorado Territory stretched before him in all directions. A vast wilderness of towering peaks, dense forests, and hidden valleys that had become his sanctuary from a world gone mad with war and greed. At 35, Elias carried the weight of too many battles in his weathered face and the careful way he moved through the forest. His beard, now streaked with premature gray, couldn't quite hide the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a reminder of Antietam, where he'd learned that sometimes the enemy's blade came from behind friendly lines. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of trapping and surviving, possessed a gentleness that few would expect from a man who'd spent 4 years as a Union scout. The cabin he'd built with his own hands sat in a clearing beside a crystal-clear stream that tumbled down from the high peaks. It was modest but solid, thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew well, and windows positioned to give him clear sightlines in all directions. Old habits from the war, when knowing who approached could mean the difference between waking up and never waking at all. Inside, the cabin reflected a man who valued function over form. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with iron hooks for his cooking pots and a wooden mantle that held his few precious possessions. In a corner sat an old wooden chest, its brass hinges green with age. Inside that chest, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a Union Army medal he'd never worn and never would, a piece of bronze and ribbon that represented everything he'd tried to leave behind in these mountains. The war had ended 8 years ago, but for Elias, peace remained as elusive as morning. Mist. He'd seen too much, done too much in service to causes that seemed righteous at the time, but left him hollow when the smoke cleared. Gettysburg, Chickamauga, the wilderness. Names that haunted his sleep and sent him walking the forest trails. At night, when memories pressed too close, his days followed a rhythm as regular as the seasons. Before dawn, he'd check the stream for fresh beaver sign. After breakfast of whatever game he'd caught and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, he'd walk his trap lines, a circuit that took him through 15 miles of the most beautiful and dangerous country God ever created. He knew every game trail, every water source, every place where a man could make a stand or find shelter from a sudden storm. The mountains had taught him patience, the kind that came from watching a deer approach a waterhole for an hour before, deciding it was safe to drink. They'd taught him to read sign the way other men read newspapers. A bent twig here, disturbed earth there, the faint musk of a predator marking territory. Most importantly, they'd taught him that sometimes the greatest wisdom lay in knowing when to be still, but solitude came with its own price. Some nights, when the wind howled through the peaks and his fire burned low, the silence pressed against him like a living thing. He'd find himself talking to his horse, a sturdy mountain-bred mare named Belle, who listened with more patience than most humans he'd known. Sometimes he'd catch himself setting 2 plates for supper before remembering. He was the only soul for 20 miles in any direction. The Apache knew of him, of course. These mountains had been their hunting grounds long before any white man set foot in Colorado territory. During his scouting days, he'd learned to respect their knowledge of the land, their ability to move through country without leaving so much as a footprint. He'd fought them when duty demanded it, but he'd also learned from them how to read weather in the behavior of animals, how to find water in country that looked dry as bone, how to become invisible when survival depended on it. Unlike many of his former colleagues, Elias harbored no particular hatred for the Apache. They were defending their homeland with the same fierce dedication he'd shown defending the Union. The difference was that his war had ended with surrender at Appomattox, while theirs continued with every sunrise. He understood their choice to fight, even as he'd chosen to remove himself from all fighting. This morning felt different, though he couldn't say why. The birds seemed more restless than usual, and Belle kept pricking her ears toward the southern trail, as if she heard something beyond his perception. Years in hostile territory had taught him to trust such instincts, his own and those of animals who'd kept him alive when lesser men had died. He moved through his morning routine with particular care, checking his rifle's load and ensuring his knife rode loose in its sheath. The war might be over, but peace was still a fragile thing in these mountains, where desperadoes, claim jumpers, and hostile war parties moved through country the army couldn't properly patrol. As he followed the main trail south toward his farthest trapline, the forest felt unusually quiet. No squirrels chattered in the branches, no woodpeckers hammered at dead trees. Even the stream seemed to murmur more softly than usual. Elias slowed his pace, every sense alert for whatever had spooked the wildlife. That's when he saw the first. Drops of blood on the pine needles. Fresh blood, bright red and still damp in the cool morning air. His practiced eye followed the trail as it led off the main path and into a thicket of young aspens. More blood here, and signs of someone moving in obvious distress, broken branches at waist height, footprints that showed an unsteady gait, drag marks, where someone had stumbled and caught themselves. Elias drew his rifle and followed the trail with the quiet patience that had kept him alive through a dozen campaigns. 50 yards into the thicket, he found her. She couldn't have been more than 20, with the high cheekbones and dark hair that marked her as Apache. She lay crumpled against the base of a large pine, one hand pressed to her side, where blood seeped between her fingers. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained, and her breathing came in short, painful gasps. But her eyes, large and dark as mountain pools, tracked his movement with the alertness of someone who wasn't ready to surrender to death. Those eyes held no fear, only a kind of resigned wariness, as if she'd already accepted whatever fate this white stranger might bring. In them, Elias saw something that reminded him of wounded soldiers he'd found on battlefields, a recognition that help might come from unexpected quarters, but that trust would have to be earned one careful action at a time. The bullet had taken her in the left side, just below the ribs. From the angle and the bleeding, it had probably missed the vital organs, but infection would kill her just as surely as the bullet if the wound wasn't properly cleaned and dressed. She needed help, and she needed it soon. But helping her would mean crossing a line he'd spent 8 years avoiding. It would mean choosing a side in conflicts that had nothing to do with him, taking responsibility for consequences he couldn't predict or control. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to melt back into the forest and let nature take its course. Instead, he holstered his rifle and approached slowly, hands visible and empty of weapons. When he knelt beside her, she tried to speak, but only managed a whisper in Apache that he didn't understand. Her fever-bright eyes never left his face as he gently moved her hand to examine the wound. "Easy now," he said softly, the way he might calm a frightened animal. "I'm not going to hurt you." Whether she understood his words or simply read his intent in his actions, some of the tension left her body. When he slipped his arms under her to lift her, she didn't resist, though a soft cry escaped her lips as the movement jarred her wound. "I know it hurts," he murmured, settling her as gently as possible in his arms. "But we need to get you somewhere safe." The walk back to his cabin seemed endless, though it couldn't have been more than a mile. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words in Apache, sometimes going so still that he feared she died in his arms. But her heart kept beating against his chest, steady if weak, and her breathing continued, even when everything else about her went quiet. Belle was waiting in the clearing when he emerged from the forest, and she snorted nervously at the scent of blood and the presence of a stranger, but she didn't bolt, testament to years of training that had made her as much partner as mount in this wilderness life. Inside the cabin, Elias laid the girl on his own bed and set about doing what he could for her wound. His medical knowledge came from battlefield experience, crude, practical, and focused on keeping wounded men alive long enough to reach proper doctors. But he knew how to clean and dress wounds, how to recognize the signs of infection, and how to brew the willow bark tea that could bring down fever. As he worked by lamplight, cutting away the torn buckskin to expose the wound, he found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. Every man reached crossroads where the easy path diverged from the right path, where comfort and safety pulled against conscience and duty. He'd faced such moments in the war, and most of the time he'd chosen duty over survival, honor over advantage. Now, as he cleaned blood from the wound of an Apache girl whose name he didn't know, he realized he was facing another such moment. Helping her was the right thing to do, the human thing to do. But it was also the dangerous thing, the complicated thing, the thing that might cost him the peace he'd spent 8 years building in these mountains. Outside, the wind picked up, setting the pines to whispering secrets in their ancient language. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, people were probably looking for this girl. Her family, her tribe, maybe the same people who'd shot her in the first place. Come morning, his peaceful existence might be nothing but a memory. But as he looked down at her face, peaceful now in unconsciousness, he knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. Some things mattered more than safety, more than solitude, more than the carefully constructed barriers he'd built against the world's troubles. Sometimes, a man had to risk everything he'd built to become the person he was meant to be. The night stretched long and fragile as spider silk. Elias sat in his wooden chair beside the bed, rifle across his knees, watching the rise and fall of the girl's breathing by the flickering light of an oil lamp. Every few minutes, he'd lean forward to check her pulse or feel her forehead for signs of fever. The bullet had passed clean through, a mercy that probably saved her life, but the wound needed constant attention to prevent infection from setting in. Around midnight, her fever broke with a violence that left his blankets soaked with sweat. She thrashed and cried out in Apache, words that sounded like prayers or warnings, her voice carrying the urgency of someone trying to deliver a message across a great distance. Elias cooled her face with a damp cloth and spoke to her in the same gentle tones he'd used to calm wounded soldiers, not expecting her to understand, but hoping the sound of human kindness might reach through her delirium. "Shema," she whispered, the word clear despite her weakness. Then Shije, and something that sounded like a name repeated over and over, "Nahina, Nahina." He didn't speak Apache, but years of scouting had taught him enough to recognize family words. Mother, father, and what was probably her own name. She was calling for people who weren't there, people who might be searching for her even now, people who might blame him for whatever had happened to her. Near dawn, she opened her eyes for the first time since he'd found her. They were clear. Now, the fever brightness replaced by the sharp awareness of someone taking stock of her situation. She looked around the cabin slowly, noting the rifle in his hands, the bandages on her wound, the unfamiliar surroundings, before her gaze settled on his face. For a long moment they studied each other across a gulf wider than the few feet between chair and bed. He saw intelligence in her eyes and caution, but not the terror he might have expected from an Apache woman waking up in a white man's cabin. She saw what He hoped she saw someone who meant her no harm, someone who'd chosen to help rather than hurt. "Water?" he asked, miming the act of drinking. She nodded slightly, and he helped her sit up enough to sip from his metal cup. The water seemed to strengthen her, bringing more alertness to her eyes and steadiness to her hands. When she tried to speak, her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why?" The word was heavily accented but clear in English. "Why help me?" The question caught him off guard, both because she spoke his language and because it cut straight to the heart of something he hadn't fully examined himself. Why had he helped her? Because it was right, because he'd seen too much death and couldn't walk away from someone who might live, because something in her eyes reminded him of his own desperate need for mercy during the war's darkest moments. "Because you needed help," he said finally, "and because I could give it." She studied his face as if trying to read the truth of his words. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. She touched the bandages at her side with careful fingers, testing the quality of his work. "You know medicine," she observed. "Army medicine," he admitted. "Battlefield medicine. Nothing fancy, but it keeps people breathing." "Army," she repeated the word with new understanding, her eyes moving to take in details she'd missed before. The way he held his rifle, the careful positioning of his chair to watch both door and window, the unconscious military bearing that 8 years in the wilderness hadn't entirely erased. "You were soldier, scout," he corrected. "Union Army during the war." Something shifted in her expression at that admission. Not fear exactly, but a new calculation, as if she was reassessing the nature of the risk she faced. Union soldiers had fought Confederates, not Apache, but the distinction might not matter to someone whose people had learned to distrust all white military men. "War over," she said, making it half statement, half question. "The war between North and South is over," he confirmed. "Has been for 8 years. But other wars—" He gestured vaguely toward the windows, toward the vast territory beyond his cabin, where conflicts between settlers and tribes continued to simmer. "Other wars go on." She was quiet for a long time, perhaps thinking about wars that had touched her own life. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "My people look for me," she said. "When they find—" She stopped, either lacking the English words or unwilling to speak the possibilities aloud. "How many?" he asked. "Many." She held up both hands, fingers spread, then repeated the gesture several times. "Warriors, angry warriors." The number didn't surprise him. During his scouting days, he'd seen Apache war parties range from a handful of raiders to groups large enough to threaten army patrols. If this girl was important enough to send many warriors searching, she was probably the daughter or wife of someone significant, a chief, a war leader, someone whose loss would demand either rescue or revenge. "When will they come?" he asked. She closed her eyes, perhaps calculating distances and the speed of mounted searchers. When she opened them again, her expression had grown grave. "Soon," she said. "Maybe sunrise." Sunrise was less than 2 hours away. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his gut that had preceded every dangerous mission during the war, the knowledge that violence was coming whether he wanted it or not, and that his survival would depend on making smart choices very quickly. He could still run, saddlebell, grab his essential gear, and disappear into country where even Apache trackers would have trouble following. Leave the girl with food and water and let her family find her when they arrived. It was the sensible choice. The choice that preserved the life he'd built and the peace he'd found. But looking at her, this young woman who'd answered his question about why he'd helped her with simple acceptance, who'd warned him of danger, even though he was a stranger from a people who'd brought nothing but trouble to her world. He knew he couldn't abandon her. Not because he thought he could fight off a large war party, but because some betrayals left scars that never healed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nahina," she said, confirming what he'd heard in her delirium, "means she who lives near the water." "My father," she paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. My father leads our band, a chief's daughter. That explained the number of searchers and the urgency behind their quest. It also meant that any violence between them and Elias would likely escalate into something much larger, the kind of incident that brought army patrols and retaliatory raids, and more death than anyone could count. "I'm Elias," he said. "Elias Cutter." She repeated his name carefully, as if committing it to memory. Then, with what might have been the ghost of a smile, "Elias who helps enemies. Are we enemies?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, her dark eyes never leaving his face. Finally, she shook her head. "Not enemies," she said, "but our peoples." She made a gesture that encompassed all the history of conflict. Between Apache and white settlers, all the raids and reprisals and broken treaties that had soaked this territory in blood. "I know," he said. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in that vast wilderness, warriors were riding toward his cabin, following sign and instinct and the desperate hope of finding their chief's daughter alive. Soon, very soon, he would have to step outside and face them, one man against many with nothing but his word and his actions to speak for his intentions. But first, he needed to understand something that had been nagging at him since he'd found her. "Nahina," he said carefully. "Who shot you?" Her expression darkened, and for the first time since she'd awakened, real fear flickered in her eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried a bitterness that spoke of betrayal and broken trust. "White men," she said, "but not settlers, not random travelers, men in blue coats, soldiers." The words hit him like a physical blow. Army men had shot the chief's daughter, not in battle, not in self-defense, but deliberately, treacherously. And now he, a former army scout, was the one trying to save her life. Dawn was coming, and with it, answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. The sun crested the eastern peaks like a burning coal, flooding the valley with golden light that made the dew on the pine needles sparkle like scattered diamonds. Elias stood in his cabin doorway, rifle in hand, watching the tree line for movement. The forest had gone completely silent. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals, nothing but the whisper of wind through the branches. Even Belle stood motionless in the clearing, ears pricked forward, nostrils flared as she tested scents carried on the morning air. Then he saw them. They emerged from the forest like shadows given substance. Warriors mounted on painted ponies, their faces streaked with war paint, their weapons glinting in the early light. They came from all directions, rising from concealment behind rocks and trees, materializing from gullies and thickets, where no man should have been able to hide. Within moments, Elias found himself looking at a sight that would have terrified most white men into immediate surrender. A full war party of Apache warriors, at least 100 strong, arrayed in a perfect circle around his cabin. But what struck him most wasn't their number or their weapons. It was their discipline. They sat their horses in complete silence, not moving, not speaking, simply watching him, with the patient intensity of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. This wasn't a raiding party drunk on war fever. This was a military operation, led by someone who understood tactics and restraint. At the center of the circle, directly opposite Elias, sat a man who could only be Nahina's father. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. He wore a chief's regalia, a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers, a breastplate of carved bone and turquoise, and ceremonial war paint that marked him as a leader of significant standing. In his right hand, he carried an ornate war lance, decorated with scalps and coup feathers, each one representing a victory in battle. Chief Running Bear, for somehow Elias knew this must be him, studied the white man in the cabin doorway with eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes took in the rifle held ready but not aimed, the respectful posture, the absence of fear in Elias's stance. Most importantly, they noted that the white man made no move to flee or fight, simply stood waiting for whatever judgment might come. For several long minutes, the tableau held, 100 Apache warriors facing one mountain man across a clearing that might as well have been a battlefield. The tension was thick enough to cut, but it was controlled tension, the kind that preceded negotiation rather than massacre. These men had come for answers, not necessarily for blood. Finally, Chief Running Bear urged his horse forward a few steps and spoke in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. The words meant nothing to Elias, but the tone suggested a question, perhaps a demand for explanation, perhaps an offer to parley. When Elias didn't respond, the chief switched to heavily accented English. "Where is my daughter?" The simple question got through all the complexity of the situation, reducing it to its essential elements. A father searching for his child. A man who would move heaven and earth, who would bring 100 warriors into hostile territory, who would risk war itself to bring his daughter home. "She's alive," Elias called back, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "She's inside, recovering from her wound." A ripple of movement went through the circle of warriors at these words. Hands tightening on weapons, horses shifting restlessly, painted faces turning toward their chief for guidance. Some of them, Elias noticed, looked barely old enough to be away from their mothers, while others bore the scars and bearing of veteran fighters. All of them looked ready to charge at a single word from their leader. "You have taken her," the chief said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I found her," Elias corrected. "Shot and bleeding. I brought her here to treat her wounds." Why should I believe white man's words? It was a fair question, given the history between their peoples. Elias considered his options carefully. Any wrong move, any word that could be interpreted as threatening or dishonest, might trigger a battle that would end with his death, and possibly Nahina's as well. But the truth was, the only weapon he had. "Because she's alive to tell you herself," he said, then raising his voice, "Nahina, your father is here." From inside the cabin came the sound of movement, followed by Nahina's voice, calling out in rapid Apache. Whatever she said caused another stir among the warriors, but this time it seemed to be relief rather than anger. Chief Running Bear's expression changed subtly, some of the stone-hard wariness replaced by what might have been hope. The chief spoke again in Apache, clearly addressing his daughter. Her response was longer this time, punctuated by what sounded like explanations or descriptions. Throughout the exchange, Running Bear's eyes never left Elias, studying him with the intensity of a man trying to read another's soul. When the conversation ended, the chief was quiet for a long moment, processing whatever his daughter had told him. When he spoke again, his voice held a note of puzzlement. "She says you saved her life. She says you are not like other white men." The chief's tone suggested he found this difficult to believe. "Why would white soldier help Apache?" "Former soldier," Elias clarified, "and I helped her because she needed help. Nothing more complicated than that." "Nothing is simple between our peoples," Running Bear replied, and the weight of history lay heavy in those words. "White men take our land, kill our people, break their promises like morning mist. Why should this time be different?" Before Elias could answer, movement at the edge of the circle caught his attention. A younger warrior, his face painted with distinctive black and red stripes, was urging his horse forward, despite Chief Running Bear's obvious disapproval. This man's eyes burned with a rage that seemed barely contained, and his grip on his war club suggested he was looking for any excuse to use it. "Father," the young warrior called out, speaking English with bitter fluency, "why do we waste words? With this white dog, he has touched our sister, violated her with his presence. The insult demands blood." Several other young warriors voiced their agreement, their war cries echoing off the surrounding peaks. But Chief Running Bear silenced them with a sharp gesture, his authority absolute, despite the obvious desire for violence among his men. "Black Wolf speaks with hot blood," the chief said, his eyes still fixed on Elias. But hot blood has cost our people much. I will hear all words before I decide what blood must be spilled." The young warrior, Black Wolf, subsided reluctantly, but his glare promised that this was far from over. Elias could see the division within the war party: older, more experienced warriors who understood the value of restraint, and younger men who had grown up knowing only conflict with white settlers. "And soldiers, your daughter needs rest and medicine," Elias said, addressing Chief Running Bear directly. "She's weak from blood loss. Moving her too soon could reopen her wounds." "You would keep my daughter as prisoner?" "I would keep her alive," Elias replied. "As any father would want." For the first time, something that might have been respect flickered in the chief's eyes. Here was a white man who spoke of fatherhood as if he understood its weight, who seemed to grasp that some bonds transcended the hatred between peoples. But before either man could speak again, Black Wolf's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "He lies. White men always lie. How do we know he has not already—" "Enough!" Chief Running Bear's command cracked like a whip, and Black Wolf fell silent. But the damage was done. The accusation hung in the air, poisoning any chance of easy resolution. The standoff continued, 100 armed men facing one, with the life of a chief's daughter hanging in the balance. The tension in the clearing stretched taut as a bowstring when the cabin door opened wider and Nahina appeared in the doorway. She moved slowly, one hand pressed to her bandaged side, but her voice carried clearly across the distance as she spoke to her father in rapid Apache. Whatever she said caused a visible shift in the warrior's posture. Weapons lowered slightly, horses calmed, and the electric anticipation of violence dimmed to a more manageable wariness. Black Wolf, however, seemed unmoved by her words. His painted face twisted with disgust as he gestured toward Elias. "She has been corrupted by his touch," he declared in English, apparently for Elias's benefit. "No true Apache woman would defend a white man who has held her in his power. She speaks with the white man's tongue now." Chief Running Bear's expression darkened at the insult to his daughter. But before he could respond, Nahina herself spoke up, her voice cutting through the morning air with surprising strength. "Black Wolf forgets himself," she said in clear English, her eyes blazing with anger. "I speak with my own tongue, as I always have. This man," she gestured toward Elias, "found me dying and chose to save my life when he could have left me to die. That is not corruption, that is honor." The young warrior's face flushed beneath his war paint, but he pressed on recklessly. "Honor? From a white soldier, they are the ones who shot you." A ripple of shock went through the assembled warriors at this revelation. Elias felt his stomach tighten as he realized the full implications of what Nahina had told them. If soldiers had indeed shot the chief's daughter, his own military background made him appear complicit in their eyes, regardless of his actual innocence. Chief Running Bear's voice carried a new edge when he spoke again. "Is this true? Did white soldiers wound my daughter?" Nahina nodded gravely. "Men in blue coats. They rode into our camp under a white flag, speaking of peace talks. When my father was not there to receive them, they became angry. When I told them he would return by sunset, they—" She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her wound. "One of them said I was lying, said all Apache lied. He pulled his gun and fired." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more dangerous. Elias could see the rage building in the warriors' faces as they processed their chief's daughter being shot under a flag of truce. Such an act violated the most basic codes of warfare, the kind of betrayal that demanded blood vengeance. "And you," Chief Running Bear said, turning his attention back to Elias, "you wear the same blue as the men who did this thing." "I wore blue once," Elias admitted, "but I left that life behind 8 years ago. I have no part in whatever happened to your daughter." "All white soldiers are the same," Black Wolf snarled. "They smile and speak of peace while reaching for their guns. This one seeks to gain our trust only to betray us when our guard is down." But Nahina spoke again, her voice stronger now despite her obvious pain. "Father, this man could have let me die. He could have taken my scalp and claimed honor among his people. Instead, he risked his own life to save mine. When I told him warriors would come seeking me, he could have run. He chose to stay. Chief Running Bear studied Elias with new interest, perhaps seeing him not as just another white soldier, but as an individual capable of making moral choices that defied easy categorization. The chief's weathered face showed the weight of leadership, the burden of making decisions that could mean life or death for his people. "My daughter speaks wisdom," he said finally. "But wisdom and safety are not the same thing. You have helped her, and for that I am grateful. But your presence here creates problems that cannot be easily solved." Elias understood what the chief wasn't saying directly. By helping Nahina, he had created a debt of honor that demanded recognition. But he had also become a witness to Apache movements and intentions, knowledge that could prove dangerous if he carried it back to white settlements. In the complex calculus of tribal warfare, good intentions sometimes mattered less than practical necessities. "What problems?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The soldiers who shot my daughter will return with more men," Chief Running Bear explained. "They will claim she was killed in a raid, that we broke the peace. They will use her death to justify taking more of our land, killing more of our people. But if she lives," he gestured toward his daughter, "if she lives to tell the truth, their lies become harder to believe." "Then tell the truth," Elias said. "Let her speak to the authorities, to the territorial governor. Make sure the real story is heard." Black Wolf laughed bitterly. "White man's authorities? They care nothing for Apache truth. They hear only what serves their purposes." Chief Running Bear nodded sadly. "Black Wolf speaks truly. We have learned that white man's justice flows only one direction, toward more white settlement, more Apache death." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats from the forest. Another group of warriors emerged from concealment, leading several horses and what appeared to be a travois. Elias recognized the practical intelligence behind the arrangement. They had come prepared to carry Nahina home, regardless of her condition. But as the newcomers approached, Elias noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the horses. They bore the distinctive markings of a U.S. Army mount, complete with military saddle and bridle. Worse, dark stains on the saddle and stirrups suggested its previous rider had met a violent end. Chief Running Bear followed Elias's gaze and nodded grimly. "The soldier who shot my daughter tried to escape. He did not succeed." The implications hit Elias like a physical blow. An army soldier was dead, killed by Apache warriors in retaliation for shooting the chief's daughter. Whatever hopes there might have been for a peaceful resolution to this situation had just disappeared. In a cloud of blood and vengeance that would demand more blood and more vengeance in return. "How many soldiers were there?" Elias asked, dreading the answer. "3, Nahina replied. "1 who shot me, 1 who held the horses, 1 who carried. The white flag, the shooter is dead, the others escaped to bring back more soldiers." Which meant that somewhere out there, 2 army men were riding hard for the nearest military post, carrying a story that would paint the Apache as treacherous killers who had murdered a soldier under a flag of truce. The truth that the soldier had shot an unarmed woman in cold blood would be lost in the rush to organize a punitive expedition. "They will say we killed their man without cause," Chief Running Bear said, reading Elias's thoughts. "They will bring many soldiers to punish us for defending my daughter's honor." "How long before they return?" Elias asked. The chief consulted, with several of his warriors in rapid Apache before answering. 2 days, maybe 3. Enough time to reach Fort Collins and return with cavalry. 2 days. Not nearly enough time for Nahina to heal sufficiently for travel, but more than enough time for the situation to spiral completely out of control. When that cavalry patrol arrived, they would find a chief's daughter recovering in a white man's cabin, with her father's war party camped nearby. The circumstances would be suspicious at best, damning at worst. There might be another way. Elias said carefully, knowing he was about to propose something that could get him killed by either side. "What if I went with your daughter to speak? To the army? What if we told them the truth together?" Black Wolf spat in the dirt. "They would never believe Apache words, even spoken by a white mouth." "Maybe not," Elias conceded, "but they might listen to a former Union scout. I have friends among the officers at Fort Collins, men who served with me during the war. They know I don't lie." Chief Running Bear considered this proposition with the careful attention it deserved. In his weathered face, Elias could see the calculations of a man who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters between survival and honor, between pragmatism and principle. "And if your soldier friends choose not to believe your words," the chief asked, "then we're no worse off than we are now," Elias replied. "But if they do listen, if the truth gets heard, maybe we can prevent a war that nobody really wants." "I want war," Black Wolf declared fiercely. "I want to water the ground with the blood of every white man who has stolen our land and murdered our people." "And after that war," Chief Running Bear asked his young warrior, "after we have killed some, whites and they have killed many Apache? After they bring more soldiers than we have arrows, what then, Black Wolf?" The young man's jaw worked furiously, but he had no answer for his chief's questions. The hard truth was that the Apache could win battles but not the war. Not against an enemy that could replace every fallen soldier with 10 more, that possessed weapons and resources the tribes could never match. "My daughter must have time to heal," Chief Running Bear said finally. "We will make camp here for 2 days. You," he pointed at Elias, "will care for her as you have done. If she grows stronger, if the white man's medicine proves good, then we will talk of your proposal." It wasn't the answer Elias had hoped for, but it wasn't outright rejection either. 2 days would give Nahina time to recover, and give all of them time to work out a plan that might prevent the coming bloodshed. "Where will you camp?" Elias asked, already knowing the answer would determine how much freedom he'd have to move around his own property. Chief Running Bear smiled, the first genuine expression of humor Elias had seen from him. "Close enough to watch, far enough to avoid tempting your enemies to attack us all at once." With hand signals and brief commands in Apache, the chief began organizing his warriors into smaller groups. Some would establish hidden camps in the surrounding forest. Others would scout the approaches to the valley, and still others would maintain constant surveillance of the cabin itself. Within minutes, the clearing that had held 100 mounted warriors was empty, except for Chief Running Bear, Black Wolf, and a handful of senior warriors. 2 days, the chief repeated, fixing Elias with a steady gaze. "If my daughter improves, we talk. If she worsens, if you betray our trust, if you prove to be like other white men—" He didn't finish the threat, but his meaning was crystal clear. As the remaining Apache melted back into the forest, Elias found himself alone with Nahina in a clearing that felt far less peaceful than it had just hours before. The girl looked exhausted from the confrontation, her face pale beneath her bronze skin, but her eyes held a spark that suggested the morning's events had strengthened rather than weakened her resolve. "You would really speak for my people too?" "Yours?" she asked. "I'd speak the truth," Elias replied. "That's all any of us can do." She studied him for a long moment, perhaps trying to understand this white man who seemed so different from the soldiers who had shot her. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. "Maybe the truth will be enough." But as Elias helped her back into the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all walking toward a precipice, and that the truth might not be nearly enough to keep any of them from falling. 3 days passed in an atmosphere of careful cooperation that felt as fragile as morning frost. Elias quickly discovered that close enough to watch meant Apache warriors positioned within sight of his cabin at all times. Not threatening exactly, but a constant reminder that he was being evaluated with every word and action. The routine that developed surprised him with its practicality. Each morning, an older Apache warrior named Grey Hawk would approach the cabin to check on Nahina's condition. Grey Hawk spoke better English than most of the others and seemed to serve as Chief Running Bear's eyes and ears. Unlike the hostile Black Wolf, this man possessed the quiet dignity of someone who had seen enough war to appreciate the value of peace. "Your medicine is good," Grey Hawk observed on the third morning, watching Elias change Nahina's bandages. "The wound heals." Clean. It was true, the bullet hole was closing nicely, with no signs of the infection that Elias had feared most. Nahina's strength was returning steadily, and she could now sit up for extended periods without becoming dizzy. More importantly, she was eating well and beginning to move around the cabin without assistance. "Army doctors taught me to clean wounds properly," Elias replied, applying fresh bandages with practiced efficiency. "Saw too many good men die from dirty doctoring during the war." Grey Hawk nodded approvingly. "You learn well. My people have medicine too, plants that fight infection, roots that ease pain. Perhaps we share knowledge." The suggestion intrigued Elias. During his scouting days, he'd heard stories of Apache medical techniques that seemed almost miraculous. Warriors, surviving wounds that would have killed white soldiers, treatments that worked faster and more completely than anything in the army medical manuals. "I'd be honored to learn," he said. That afternoon, Grey Hawk returned with a leather pouch containing various dried herbs and roots. As Nahina translated, the medicine man explained the properties of each plant, which ones reduced inflammation, which ones fought infection, which ones eased pain without clouding the mind. In return, Elias shared what he knew about surgical techniques and wound cleaning, demonstrating with instruments from his own kit. The exchange felt like the beginning of something larger, a bridge across the cultural divide that had separated their peoples for so long, but it also highlighted how much they had to learn from each other and how much had been lost to mutual suspicion and fear. "Your people have much knowledge," Grey Hawk observed as they worked together to prepare a poultice for Nahina's wound. "But you use it only for war." "Not only for war," Elias corrected, "but war teaches harsh lessons quickly. A man learns to stop bleeding fast when lives depend on it." "Apache learn medicine from war too," the old warrior admitted, "but also from land, from animals, from spirits that speak to those who listen. White men seem deaf to such voices." It was a fair criticism, Elias thought. White settlement had brought many benefits: better tools, more efficient farming techniques, improved transportation, but it had also brought a disconnection from the natural world that the Apache still maintained. Where white doctors relied on expensive medicines shipped from eastern cities, Apache healers found their remedies growing wild in the mountains and valleys. The afternoon brought another visitor, Chief Running Bear himself, accompanied by a younger warrior who carried what appeared to be hunting tools. The chief's manner was more relaxed than during their first meeting, suggesting that Elias's care of his daughter had earned him at least provisional acceptance. "My daughter grows stronger," the chief observed, speaking with Nahina in Apache. Before turning back to Elias, "You have kept your word. She is safe, she heals well." "She's young and strong," Elias replied. "The wound was clean, and she's fighting hard to recover. Still, without your help, she would have died." Chief Running Bear's tone carried the weight of a man acknowledging a debt he took seriously. "Among my people, such a debt creates obligations." Elias sensed he was entering territory that required careful navigation. Apache concepts of honor and obligation were complex, with nuances that could have far-reaching consequences if misunderstood. "I didn't help her for any reward," he said carefully. "I helped her because it was the right thing to do." "I understand this," the chief replied, "but right actions still create bonds between people. You have become connected to my family, to my band. This cannot be undone simply because it was not intended." The implications of this statement were significant. If Chief Running Bear considered Elias somehow connected to his people, it could provide protection, but also bring responsibilities that might conflict with his desire for solitude. Before he could respond, however, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Black Wolf appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face grim with news that was obviously unwelcome. He spoke rapidly to his chief in Apache, gesturing toward the southern trail that led to the lower valleys. Whatever he reported caused Chief Running Bear's expression to harden. "What is it?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Soldiers," the chief replied. "A large patrol, riding hard toward our territory. They are still 2 days away, but they come seeking blood for their dead brother." The news hit Elias like a physical blow. 2 days. Not nearly enough time for Nahina to travel safely, but more than enough time for the situation to become explosive. When that cavalry patrol arrived, they would find exactly what they were looking for: Apache warriors in territory they were supposed to have vacated, with a dead soldier's horse in their possession. "How many soldiers?" he asked. "Maybe 40, Black Wolf answered with obvious relish, "led by the yellow-hair captain who speaks of peace while planning war." Elias felt his blood chill. Yellow-hair captain could only mean Captain Mitchell Hartley, a career officer who had built his reputation on aggressive campaigns against hostile tribes. Hartley was known for his ruthless efficiency and his belief that the only good Apache was a dead Apache. If he was leading the patrol, negotiation would be the last thing on his mind. "Captain Hartley," Elias said, and saw recognition flicker in Chief Running Bear's eyes. "You know this man. We served together during the war. He's a good soldier, but he has no love for your people. If he's coming here, he's not coming to talk." Chief Running Bear nodded grimly. "Then we must be ready for war. Or," Elias said carefully, "we could be ready with the truth." Black Wolf snorted derisively. "Truth means nothing to Hartley. He sees Apache, he kills Apache. It is that simple." "Maybe," Elias conceded. "But what if he didn't see Apache? What if he saw only a wounded woman recovering in a mountain cabin, with her rescuer ready to testify about what really happened?" The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and easily dispersed. Chief Running Bear studied Elias with the intensity of a man trying to read the future in another's face. "You would stand between my warriors and your soldiers?" the chief asked. "You would risk your life to speak words they may not wish to hear?" "I would risk it to prevent a war that would solve nothing," Elias replied. "Your people would die. My people would die, and the truth would be buried under all that blood." For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the pines. Then Nahina spoke from the cabin doorway, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Father, let him try. Let him speak the words that need to be spoken. If he fails, you can still choose war. But if he succeeds, Chief Running Bear finished, perhaps our children will not have to fight the battles we have fought." The decision, when it came, felt like the shifting of massive weights, the realignment of forces that had been locked in conflict for generations. Chief Running Bear looked at his daughter, at his warriors, at the white man who had chosen to help rather than harm. 2 days, he said finally. "We will give you 2 days to prove that truth is stronger than hatred." The morning of the second day dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the meadow grass silver and the peaks standing sharp against a sky the color of deep water. Elias had spent most of the night planning what he would say to Captain Hartley, rehearsing arguments that might penetrate years of mutual hatred and suspicion. But as he watched the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, he wondered if any words would be enough to prevent the violence that seemed to be rushing toward them like an avalanche. Nahina was strong enough now to move around the cabin without assistance, though she still tired easily and favored her wounded side. More importantly, her mind was clear and her resolve firm. She had insisted on being present when the soldiers arrived, determined to speak her own truth regardless of the consequences. "You don't have to do this," Elias told her as she practiced, walking without wincing. "I could tell them you're too weak to travel, keep you safe inside while I handle the talking." She fixed him with a look that reminded him powerfully of her father's steady gaze. Would you hide if someone lied about you? Would you let others speak for you when your own voice could tell the truth? Her question cut straight to the heart of his own motivations. He had chosen to become involved in this situation not because it was safe or easy, but because it was right. How could he ask her to make a different choice? Your father won't like it, he warned, putting you at risk when you're still recovering. My father raised me to be strong, she replied. Strong. Enough to face consequences of my own choices. I chose to meet with those soldiers under a white flag. I choose now to face their captain and tell him what his men did. Outside, Chief Running Bear was conducting his own preparations. Through the cabin windows, Elias could see the war chief, conferring with his senior warriors, positioning them in concealed locations around the clearing. The Apache would be invisible to approaching cavalry, but ready to respond instantly if the negotiations went wrong. Greyhawk approached the cabin, near midday carrying a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Inside were items that made Elias's breath catch: a ceremonial pipe decorated with eagle feathers and turquoise beads, a small pouch of what looked like sacred tobacco, and a white cloth that had been painted with symbols he didn't recognize. Peace. Symbols, the medicine man explained. In case your words are not enough, perhaps ancient customs will speak louder. Elias accepted the bundle with the gravity it deserved, understanding that he was being entrusted with objects of deep spiritual significance. I'll treat them with respect. I know you will, Greyhawk replied, or my chief would not have given them to you. The afternoon brought the sound they had all been expecting, hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls, growing steadily louder as the cavalry patrol approached. Elias positioned himself in the cabin doorway, the peace bundle visible in his hands, while Nahina stood just inside where she could be seen but not easily targeted. When the cavalry finally emerged from the tree line, Elias felt his stomach tighten with recognition. Captain Mitchell Hartley led the column on a magnificent bay gelding, his uniform immaculate despite days of hard riding. Behind him rode nearly 50 soldiers, far more than Black Wolf's estimate, and enough to overwhelm any Apache force in the area. But it was the man riding beside Hartley who made Elias's blood run cold. Lieutenant William Crenshaw was a political appointee whose family had bought him his commission, a man known for his hatred of Indians and his willingness to interpret orders in the most aggressive possible manner. If Crenshaw was advising Hartley, the chances of a peaceful resolution had just dropped considerably. The cavalry formed a line across the clearing, carbines ready but not quite aimed at the cabin. Hartley spurred his horse forward a few paces, his weathered face showing no surprise at finding Elias Cutter in this remote location. "Well, well," the captain called out. "Elias Cutter, as I live and breathe. Should have known we'd find you. Mixed up in this mess." "Mitchell," Elias replied, using the captain's first name deliberately to emphasize their shared history. "Been a while. Not long enough, apparently." Hartley's tone held no warmth, despite their past service together. "You want to explain why you're harboring hostile Apache in violation of federal law?" "I'm not harboring anyone," Elias replied carefully. "I found a wounded woman and provided medical assistance. That's not a crime in any law I know." "Lieutenant," Crenshaw urged his horse forward, his face flushed with anger. "The hell it isn't. That woman is the daughter of a hostile chief, and her people murdered Sergeant Morrison in cold blood." "Did they?" Elias asked. "Or did Sergeant Morrison shoot an unarmed woman under a flag of truce?" The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Several of the soldiers shifted restlessly in their saddles, and Elias could see doubt flickering in some of their faces. Morrison had not been well liked among the enlisted men, and stories of his brutality toward civilians had circulated despite official silence. "That's a serious charge, Cutter," Hartley said, his voice carefully neutral. "You have proof?" "I have a witness," Elias replied, stepping aside to give the soldiers a clear view of Nahina in the doorway. "The woman Morrison shot." "Lieutenant, Crenshaw's face darkened further. We're supposed to take the word of a savage. She'd say anything to protect her murdering relatives. But Captain Hartley was studying Nahina with the practiced eye of a veteran officer. He could see that she was indeed wounded, that she moved with the careful deliberation of someone still recovering from serious injury. More importantly, he could see that she showed no fear of the soldiers, not the reaction he would expect from someone who had been kidnapped or threatened. "Ma'am," Hartley said, addressing Nahina directly, "are you being held here against your will?" "No," she replied clearly. "This man saved my life. I stay because I choose to stay while I heal." "And you claim Sergeant Morrison shot you?" "I do." "Not claim," Nahina said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "I state fact. Your sergeant came to our camp under white flag. When I told him my father was hunting and would return by sunset, he became angry. He said all Apache." "Lie! Then he shot me and rode away." Lieutenant Crenshaw spurred his horse forward aggressively. "Lies! Morrison was a good soldier who died doing his duty. Morrison was a butcher who got what he deserved," Nahina replied without flinching. "My warriors caught him before he could escape. They gave him more mercy than he gave me." The lieutenant's hand moved toward his sidearm, but Captain Hartley's sharp command stopped him cold. "Stand down, Lieutenant. We're here to investigate, not to execute prisoners." "She's not a prisoner," Elias interjected. "She's a victim who's recovering from wounds inflicted by your men. And she's willing to testify to that effect before any authority you choose." Hartley considered this carefully. As a career officer, he understood the political implications of the situation. If Morrison had indeed violated a flag of truce by shooting an unarmed woman, it would be a scandal that could reach all the way to Washington. But if the Apache were lying to cover their own crimes, allowing them to escape justice would be equally damaging to his career. "You're asking me to take the word of hostiles over one of my own men," he said finally. "I'm asking you to listen to the truth," Elias replied, "from someone who has no reason to lie and everything to lose by speaking." For a long moment, the clearing was silent, except for the stamping of horses and the whisper of wind through the pines. Then Chief Running Bear's voice carried clearly from the forest edge, "Captain Hartley, I would speak with you." The effect on the soldiers was immediate. Weapons snapped up, horses pranced nervously, and several men looked ready to bolt. But Chief Running Bear emerged from concealment alone, his hands empty of weapons, walking with the dignity of a leader who had nothing to hide. "I am Running Bear," he said, stopping well within rifle range. "The woman you see is my daughter. The truth she speaks is my truth also." Lieutenant Crenshaw's voice cracked with hysteria. "It's a trap! They're surrounding us!" But Captain Hartley was watching the Apache chief with the attention of a professional soldier evaluating a potential enemy. What he saw was not a savage planning treachery, but a father seeking justice for his wounded daughter. "Chief Running Bear," Hartley said formally, "I know your reputation. You're not known for lies or ambushes." "Nor you," the chief replied. "You are known as hard, but fair. That is why I show myself to you now, though your lieutenant's hand trembles on his gun." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with 40 years of warfare and mistrust weighing against the simple human desire to do what was right. In that balance, Elias saw both the best and worst possibilities for the future: peace built on truth and understanding, or more war built on fear and hatred. The choice, he realized, lay with Captain Hartley, and in the captain's weathered face, Elias could see the weight of that choice settling like snow on the mountains. Captain Hartley's decision came with the measured deliberation of a man who had learned to weigh consequences carefully. He dismounted and walked toward the cabin, his hand conspicuously away from his sidearm, his bearing that of an officer conducting an official investigation rather than preparing for battle. "Lieutenant Crenshaw, have the men maintain their positions, but stand down from ready status," he ordered. "This is a parley, not a fight." Crenshaw's face flushed red with indignation. "Sir, with respect, we should be arresting these hostiles, not negotiating with them." "Your objection is noted, Lieutenant," Hartley replied coldly. "Now follow my orders." As the soldiers relaxed slightly in their saddles, Hartley approached the cabin where Elias waited with the peace bundle. Up close, the captain could see the careful way Nahina held herself, the bandages visible beneath her doe-skin dress, the pale cast to her skin that spoke of recent blood loss. "Miss," he said respectfully, "I need to ask you some difficult questions about what happened to you." "I will answer," Nahina replied. "Truth is not difficult to speak. Tell me about the day you were shot. Everything you remember." Nahina's account was clear and detailed, delivered without emotion, but with the kind of specificity that carried conviction. She described the 3 soldiers approaching under a white flag, her father's absence on a hunting trip, Morrison's growing anger when told he would have to wait for the chief's return. He said, "All Apache were liars and thieves," she continued. "He said we deserved whatever happened to us. When I told him again that my father would return by sunset, he pulled his gun and said he was tired of Apache promises. And then he shot me. Here." She touched her bandaged side. "I fell, and they rode away quickly. They thought I was dead." Captain Hartley examined the wound with the clinical eye of a man who had seen plenty of gunshot injuries. The angle was consistent with her story, and the healing pattern suggested it was indeed several days old. More tellingly, there were powder burns on her dress that indicated a shot fired at close range, not the kind of wound one would expect from a battle or distant skirmish. "What happened to Sergeant Morrison?" Chief Running Bear answered this question. "My warriors tracked the soldiers who shot my daughter. 2 escaped, 1 did not. You killed him. He was executed for violating the white flag and attempting to murder an unarmed woman," the chief replied without apology. "Even among your people, such crimes carry the death penalty." Lieutenant Crenshaw could contain himself no longer. "Captain, this is exactly what we expected. Lies designed to justify murder. Morrison was a decorated soldier who would never—" "Lieutenant!" Hartley's voice cracked like a whip. "One more interruption, and you'll find yourself under arrest for insubordination." But the lieutenant's outburst had revealed something that made Elias's blood run cold. In Crenshaw's flushed face and panicked eyes, he saw not righteous indignation, but the fear of a man whose lies were being exposed. The young officer knew something about Morrison's death that he wasn't sharing. "Lieutenant Crenshaw," Elias said carefully, "you seem very certain about what Morrison would or wouldn't do. Were you there when it happened?" The question hit its target. Crenshaw's face went pale, and his eyes darted toward Captain Hartley before he could stop himself. In that brief moment of panic, he revealed more than a full confession could have. "Done. No, of course not," he stammered. "But I knew Morrison. He was a good soldier, a Christian man who wouldn't hurt an innocent—" "How do you know she was innocent?" Chief Running Bear interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "My daughter told you nothing of our meeting before today, yet you speak as if you know what happened." The trap had been sprung with surgical precision. Crenshaw realized his mistake too late, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Captain Hartley's expression shifted from professional curiosity to cold suspicion as he studied his subordinate with new eyes. "Lieutenant," Hartley said slowly, "I think you need to tell us exactly what you know about this incident." "Nothing. I know nothing more than what was in Morrison's report." "Morrison never filed a report," Hartley cut him off. "He was killed before he could return to base. So how do you know what he was supposed to report?" The silence that followed was deafening. Crenshaw looked like a man watching his career and possibly his life crumble before his eyes. Around the clearing, soldiers who had served under both officers began to realize that something far more complex than a simple Apache raid was unfolding. Elias felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind, pieces that formed a picture far uglier than random violence or cultural misunderstanding. "Captain," he said quietly, "I think you need to search the lieutenant's saddlebags." "On what authority?" Crenshaw demanded, but his voice carried no conviction. "On the authority of a man who's starting to suspect treason," Hartley replied grimly. He gestured to two sergeants. "Search Lieutenant Crenshaw's gear, all of it." The search didn't take long. In the lieutenant's saddlebags, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden beneath spare ammunition, the sergeants found documents that made Captain Hartley's face turn stone cold with fury. Maps of Apache territory marked with proposed railway routes. Correspondence with territorial officials discussing land values and mineral rights. And most damning of all, a written agreement between Crenshaw and a consortium of Eastern investors, promising military action to clear Apache resistance in exchange for generous compensation. "You son of a bitch," Hartley breathed, his military composure cracking for the first time. "You were selling information to land speculators." Crenshaw made one last desperate attempt at denial. "Those documents are fabricated. This is all an Apache trick too." But his protests died as Hartley held up the most damning piece of evidence, a letter in Crenshaw's own handwriting, detailing plans to provoke Apache retaliation that would justify a major military campaign. The Taos shooting of the chief's daughter should provide sufficient pretext for operations, Hartley read aloud. "Morrison's death, while regrettable, serves our larger purposes." He looked up at his lieutenant with disgust. "You planned this. You sent Morrison to provoke an incident. It was for the good of the territory," Crenshaw burst out, abandoning all pretense. "These savages are sitting on land that could support thousands of settlers, millions of dollars. In mineral wealth, someone had to have the courage to do what needed to be done by murdering an unarmed woman, by creating the justification for military action that would have happened anyway. The Apache can't hold this territory forever. I was just speeding up the inevitable." Chief Running Bear's voice cut through the clearing like a blade. "Your inevitable has cost my people many lives. How many more of my children would have died? For your eastern gold?" The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear now. Crenshaw and his associates had been planning to use false flag operations to justify a campaign of extermination against the Apache, clearing the way for mining and railway interests to claim tribal lands. Morrison's shooting of Nahina was supposed to provoke retaliation that would give the army carte blanche to attack Apache settlements throughout the territory. "The other soldier who escaped," Elias said. "He was part of this too." Crenshaw's silence was answer enough. Captain Hartley ordered the man placed under arrest, his face grim with the knowledge that he would have to unravel a conspiracy that might reach all the way to Washington. "Captain," Chief Running Bear said formally, "my daughter spoke truth. Your lieutenant speaks lies. What justice will there be?" Hartley looked around the clearing, at the Apache chief who had risked everything to seek peaceful resolution, at his own soldiers who were beginning to understand how close they had come to participating in atrocity, at Elias and Nahina who had chosen courage over safety. "There will be justice," he said finally. "Real justice, not the kind that comes from the end of a gun. Lieutenant Crenshaw will face court-martial for treason, conspiracy, and the attempted murder of a civilian, under a flag of truce." "And my people?" Chief Running Bear asked. "Will there be war?" "Not if I can prevent it," Hartley replied. "This entire incident was based on lies and greed. With your permission, I'd like to escort Miss Running Bear to Fort Collins, where she can give sworn testimony about what really happened. Her words, combined with these documents, should be enough to expose the whole conspiracy." For the first time since the cavalry had arrived, Elias felt hope beginning to replace dread. The truth had emerged. Justice was being promised, and the war that had seemed inevitable just hours before was beginning to recede like storm clouds after rain. But as he looked around the clearing, seeing Apache warriors emerging from concealment, and soldiers lowering their weapons, he knew that this was just the beginning. The real work, building trust between peoples who had known only conflict, creating a future based on understanding rather than fear, would take far longer than a single day's revelations. Still, it was a beginning. And sometimes, Elias reflected, a beginning was the most anyone could ask for. The hours following Lieutenant Crenshaw's arrest moved with the careful precision of a military operation, but underneath the formal procedures lay currents of tension that could still explode into violence. Captain Hartley had accepted the truth of Nahina's testimony and the evidence of Crenshaw's conspiracy, but not all of his soldiers shared their commander's willingness to trust Apache word over military loyalty. Sergeant Murphy, a grizzled veteran who had served with Morrison for 3 years, approached Hartley as the captain supervised Crenshaw's restraint. His weathered face showed the struggle between duty and personal conviction. "Captain," he said quietly, "the men are having a hard time with this. Morrison might have been a bastard, but he was our bastard. Some of the boys are saying we're taking the word of hostiles over our own." Hartley paused in his examination of the confiscated documents to study his senior non-commissioned officer. Murphy was a good soldier, the kind of man who held units together through loyalty and common sense. If he was expressing doubts, it meant the problem went deeper than Hartley had realized. "What do you think, Sergeant?" Hartley asked. "You knew Morrison better than most." Murphy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the documents in Hartley's hands to Nahina, who sat on a stump near the cabin while Greyhawk checked her bandages. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. "I think Morrison was capable of shooting an unarmed woman if he thought it would advance his interests," Murphy said finally. "And I think Lieutenant Crenshaw was fool enough to believe he could profit from other people's blood." He paused, then added, "But I also think some of the men would rather fight Apache than admit they've been played for fools." It was an honest assessment of a dangerous situation. Soldiers were trained to follow orders and trust their officers, but they were also human beings with pride and prejudices that didn't disappear just because evidence was presented. The revelation that they had been manipulated into a near massacre would be hard for some men to accept. "How many men are we talking about?" Hartley asked. "Maybe a dozen who are really worked up about it. Corporal Jenkins is doing most of the talking, saying this is all some Apache trick to avoid punishment for Morrison's murder." Hartley knew Jenkins, a recent transfer from a unit that had been decimated in a previous Apache raid. The man had legitimate grievances against hostile tribes, but his hatred had made him incapable of distinguishing between individuals and entire peoples. In the current situation, such blindness could prove catastrophic. "I want Jenkins and his supporters kept separated from the Apache," Hartley ordered, "and make it clear that any man who disobeys orders will face court-martial alongside Crenshaw." But even as he gave the order, Hartley knew that military discipline could only hold back personal hatred for so long. The situation required more than just commands. It required trust, and trust was exactly what had been shattered by Crenshaw's betrayal. Meanwhile, Chief Running Bear was facing similar challenges among his own warriors. Black Wolf had been silent during the confrontation with the soldiers, but as the Apache regrouped in the forest, his anger erupted like a volcano that had been building pressure for years. "You trust white words again, Father," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing where both groups could hear. "How many times must we learn the same lesson? They speak of justice now, but tomorrow they will speak of extermination." Several younger warriors nodded their agreement, their faces reflecting the same skepticism that had driven decades of warfare. From their perspective, white promises had a history of dissolving like morning mist, leaving only broken treaties and murdered families in their wake. Chief Running Bear's response was measured but firm. "Would you have us reject justice when it is offered? Would you make enemies of men who could be allies? I would have us trust in our own strength rather than their mercy," Black Wolf replied. "This captain speaks fairly now because we have weapons pointed at his men. What will he say when he returns to his fort with superior numbers? It was a legitimate concern, Elias realized. The current situation was balanced on a knife's edge of mutual deterrence, both sides armed and ready, neither side certain of the other's ultimate intentions. Remove that balance, and old hatreds could reassert themselves with deadly consequences. Nahina, who had been listening to the exchange while pretending to rest, finally spoke up. Her voice was weak from her injuries, but clear with conviction. "Black. Wolf speaks from old wounds," she said, "but I speak from new hope. This white man," she gestured toward Elias, "could have let me die or turned me over to soldiers for reward. Instead, he risked his life to save mine. If one white man can choose honor over hatred, perhaps others can make the same choice." "Pretty words," Black Wolf replied bitterly, "but words do not stop bullets. Words do not bring back the dead." "Neither does more killing," Chief Running Bear observed. "We have fought the white man for 20 years. Are we stronger now than when we began? Are our children safer? Our lands more secure?" The questions hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, bringing with them the scent of all the battles fought and all the losses endured. Every warrior present had personal reasons for hatred. Family members killed, sacred sites desecrated, promises broken by men who spoke of civilization while practicing barbarism. Yet here they stood, facing a moment when different choices might be possible. Captain Hartley had shown willingness to listen to truth over prejudice. Elias had demonstrated that individual white men could act with honor. Even some of the soldiers seemed shaken by the revelation of Crenshaw's conspiracy, suggesting that not all of them were committed to blind hatred. Greyhawk, who had been preparing medicine pouches in thoughtful silence, finally added his voice to the discussion. As the band's spiritual advisor, his words carried weight that went beyond military considerations. "I have dreamed of this day," he said quietly. "In my vision, I saw two paths stretching before our people. One led through more battles, more death, until our children became strangers to peace. The other led through difficult choices and dangerous truths, but it ended in a place where Apache and white men could share the same sky without drawing weapons." "Dreams are not battle plans," Black Wolf countered, "and visions do not stop cavalry charges." "No," Greyhawk agreed, "but they show us which battles are worth fighting. The question we face now is not whether we can defeat these soldiers. We probably can. The question is whether defeating them will bring us closer to the world we want our children to inherit." The debate continued as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the clearing. Both groups struggled with the fundamental challenge of overcoming generations of mistrust, of making choices based on hope rather than fear. For men trained in warfare, the decision to pursue peace required a kind of courage that was harder to summon than battlefield bravery. Elias found himself in the unique position of understanding both sides' concerns. He had fought in a war that supposedly ended slavery and preserved the Union, only to watch the peace dissolve into new forms of conflict and oppression. He knew how easily noble intentions could be corrupted by practical considerations, how quickly allies could become enemies when interests diverged. But he also knew that the alternative to trying for peace was the certainty of more war. And this war, unlike the conflict between North and South, would not end with surrender ceremonies and formal treaties. It would end with the complete destruction of one side or the other, leaving nothing but graves and grievances for future generations to inherit. As evening approached, Captain Hartley made a decision that would test everyone's commitment to the fragile détente they had achieved. He approached Chief Running Bear with a proposal that was either brilliant diplomacy or dangerous folly. "Chief," he said formally, "I want to invite you and a small delegation to accompany us to Fort Collins, not as prisoners, but as official witnesses to testify about this conspiracy. Your daughter's testimony alone might not be enough to convince a military tribunal, but your word combined with the documentary evidence, could ensure that justice is done. The proposal was audacious in its implications. It would require the Apache to place themselves voluntarily in the heart of military power, trusting in the honor of men whose predecessors had broken countless promises. But it would also demonstrate their commitment to peaceful resolution in a way that could not be dismissed or ignored. And if this tribunal decides that Apache words carry no weight, Chief Running Bear asked, if they choose to believe comfortable lies over difficult truths, then you will have lost nothing more than a few days, Hartley replied. But if they listen, if justice is done, then perhaps we can begin to build something better than the hatred we've inherited. The chief looked around the clearing, taking in the faces of his warriors, his daughter, and the white men who were asking him to risk everything on the promise of fairness. In his weathered features, Elias could see the weight of leadership, the knowledge that his decision would affect not just himself, but everyone who looked to him for guidance. I will consider your proposal, Chief Running Bear said finally. But first, I must speak with my people. Such a choice cannot be made by one man alone. As the two groups separated to hold their respective councils, Elias felt the tension ratcheting up rather than diminishing. The most crucial decisions lay ahead, and the margin for error was growing smaller with each passing hour. One wrong word, one moment of lost temper, one act of betrayal, and the fragile hope they had built could shatter like glass struck by lightning. But looking at Nahina, who sat quietly preparing for whatever choice her father made, Elias felt a stubborn optimism taking root in his chest. She had survived a bullet meant to start a war. Perhaps that survival could become the foundation for something better, a peace built not on victory or defeat, but on the simple recognition that their shared humanity was stronger than their inherited hatred. The Apache Council lasted well into the night, voices rising and falling around the carefully banked fires hidden deep in the forest. Elias could hear fragments of heated debate carried on the mountain wind, arguments that needed no translation to convey their urgency and passion. The future of Chief Running Bear's people hung in the balance, and every warrior had opinions about which path would lead to survival. When dawn broke gray and cold over the peaks, Chief Running Bear emerged from the trees with his decision made. His face showed the exhaustion of a man who had wrestled with impossible choices and found no perfect answers, but his bearing remained steady and resolute. Captain Hartley, he called across the clearing, I will accept your invitation, but I bring conditions. Hartley approached cautiously, aware that the next few minutes could determine whether the fragile peace they had built would survive or shatter completely. Behind him, Sergeant Murphy and several other soldiers took positions that allowed them to respond quickly if negotiations broke down. What conditions? Hartley asked. I will bring 6 warriors, including my daughter, when she is strong enough to travel. We will carry weapons, as befits men traveling through hostile territory, and we will have the right to leave Fort Collins if we judge that your tribunal seeks vengeance rather than justice. The terms were reasonable under the circumstances, but Elias could see the tension in Hartley's shoulders as he considered their implications. Bringing armed Apache into a military installation would be seen as either an act of unprecedented trust or dangerous foolishness, depending on who was doing the judging. Agreed, Hartley said finally, but I'll need your word that your warriors will respect military authority while on the post. You have it, Chief Running Bear replied. As long as your soldiers respect our status as official witnesses rather than prisoners. Black Wolf stepped forward from the tree line, his face painted with fresh war markings that spoke of a man prepared for battle. His hand rested on his war club as he addressed both leaders. Father, I cannot support this choice, he said formally. You risk our lives on white promises that have been broken too many times before. I ask permission to return to our main camp with those warriors who share my concerns. It was a moment of high drama, the kind of challenge to authority that could split a tribal band down the middle. But Chief Running Bear handled it with the wisdom of a leader who understood that unity built on fear was no unity at all. "Permission granted," he said simply. "Take any warrior who chooses to follow you. But remember, if this path leads to justice, you will have missed the chance to help build it. If it leads to betrayal, you will be free to say you warned us." Black Wolf nodded stiffly, his honor satisfied by being heard even if his counsel was not followed. Within minutes, nearly half the Apache warriors had melted back into the forest with him, leaving Chief Running Bear with a smaller but completely committed force. Captain Hartley watched this division with professional interest, recognizing the courage it took for a leader to let potential allies walk away rather than force unwilling cooperation. But he also understood that he was now dealing with Apache who had chosen this path deliberately, making them either more trustworthy or more dangerous, depending on how events unfolded. "When do we leave?" Chief Running Bear asked. "This afternoon," Hartley replied. "That gives Miss Running Bear time to rest and gives both our groups time to prepare for what comes next." As the morning progressed, both sides made their preparations with the careful attention to detail that marked professional warriors. The soldiers cleaned weapons and checked equipment while maintaining watchful readiness. The Apache performed ceremonies and rituals that seemed designed to prepare spirits as well as bodies for the journey ahead. Elias found himself in the strange position of being trusted by both groups while belonging fully to neither. Chief Running Bear had invited him to accompany the delegation, recognizing that his testimony might carry weight that Apache words alone could not command. Captain Hartley had agreed, understanding that Elias's presence might help prevent misunderstandings that could turn deadly. Nahina spent the morning resting and gathering strength for the journey ahead. Her wound was healing well, but the ride to Fort Collins would test her endurance and potentially reopen injuries that were still tender. Despite this, she insisted on going, driven by a determination to see justice done that reminded Elias powerfully of her father's resolute character. "Are you certain about this?" Elias asked as he helped her prepare for travel. "There's no shame in waiting until you're fully healed." "There is shame in hiding when truth needs to be spoken," she replied. "My voice may be the one that prevents more killing. How can I stay silent?" As afternoon approached and both groups prepared to mount up, Elias felt the weight of history settling around them like mountain mist. They were about to attempt something that had never been tried before. Apache and army working together to expose a conspiracy that could have led to genocide. The stakes could not be higher, and the margin for error could not be smaller. But as he looked around the clearing where so much had already been risked and achieved, Elias felt a stubborn hope taking root in his chest. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the simple courage to trust in justice over vengeance, truth over convenience. The real test was still ahead. The tribunal at Fort Collins convened 3 days later in the post's largest conference room, with territorial officials, senior army officers, and civilian witnesses crowding into every available space. News of the conspiracy had spread rapidly through military and political circles, bringing investigators from as far away as Denver and Santa Fe to hear testimony that could reshape territorial policy. Colonel Harrison Webb, the post commander, presided over the proceedings with the grim efficiency of a man who understood that his own career hung in the balance. If the conspiracy proved real and extensive, it would reflect poorly on every officer who had failed to detect it. If it proved false, it would mean that Apache testimony had been used to destroy the reputation of white soldiers and officials. Lieutenant Crenshaw sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a civilian lawyer who had arrived that morning on the Denver stage. His face showed none of the panic that had marked his confession in the mountains, replaced now by the cold calculation of a man fighting for his life. Beside him sat copies of documents that his lawyer claimed were forgeries, part of an elaborate Apache deception designed to escape punishment for Morrison's murder. Chief Running Bear occupied a place of honor at the witness table, his ceremonial dress creating a striking contrast to the military blue that dominated the room. Nahina sat beside him, pale but determined, while Elias and the other witnesses waited their turn to speak. The formal setting lent gravity to proceedings that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. The defendant stands accused of conspiracy, treason, and the attempted murder of civilians under a flag of truce, Colonel Webb announced. These are capital charges that demand the clearest possible evidence and the most careful consideration of testimony. Grenshaw's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Pemberton, rose immediately to address the tribunal. "Gentlemen, my client stands falsely accused by hostile savages seeking to escape justice for their own crimes. The so-called evidence against him consists of forged documents and coached testimony designed to confuse the real issues in this case. It was a clever opening, playing to the prejudices that most of the officers brought to the proceedings. But Captain Hartley's response was equally calculated, drawing on his own reputation and service record to establish credibility. "Gentlemen," Hartley said as he took the witness stand, "I have served with distinction in this territory for 15 years. I have fought Apache when duty required it, and I have negotiated with them when peace was possible. I can tell you without reservation that the testimony you will hear today is truthful, and the documents we recovered are genuine." The prosecution methodically built its case through the morning, presenting evidence and testimony that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching far beyond Lieutenant Crenshaw. The forged land grants, the correspondence with Eastern investors, the payments made to territorial officials, all of it formed a web of conspiracy that had used military resources for private gain. But the defense fought back with equal determination, challenging every piece of evidence and questioning the motives of every witness. When Nahina took the stand to describe her shooting, Pemberton's cross-examination was particularly brutal. "Miss Running Bear," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "you admit that your people killed Sergeant Morrison in cold blood. My people executed a man who shot an unarmed woman under a flag of truce," she replied steadily. "In any civilized society, such a crime would be punished by death. But you have only your word that Morrison shot you deliberately. Is it not possible that he was defending himself against an Apache attack? I was unarmed and alone when he shot me," Nahina said. "If that is how your soldiers defend themselves, perhaps they should find other work." The exchange drew scattered laughter from the gallery, but also murmurs of disapproval from officers who saw her response as insubordinate. Elias could see the tribunal members struggling with their own preconceptions, trying to reconcile the intelligent, articulate woman before them with their assumptions about savage Apache. When Elias finally took the stand, he spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had earned the right to be heard. His testimony about finding Nahina, treating her wounds, and witnessing the confrontation between Apache and soldiers carried the weight of professional military experience. "Mr. Cutter," Pemberton challenged, "you admit to harboring hostile Apache in violation of federal law." "I admit to saving the life of a wounded woman," Elias replied. "If that's a crime in your law, then your law needs changing. But surely you understand the difficulty of taking Apache word over that of United States soldiers?" Elias looked directly at the tribunal members as he answered, "I understand the difficulty of choosing truth over convenience, but I also understand that convenience built on lies has a way of creating more problems than it solves." The proceedings continued through the afternoon, with expert testimony about the authenticity of documents and detailed analysis of the conspiracy's scope. As the evidence mounted, even the most skeptical tribunal members began to accept that something far larger than a simple Apache raid had been uncovered. Colonel Webb's final questions went to the heart of the matter. "Chief Running Bear, if this tribunal finds in your favor, what assurance can you give that your people will honor the peace we're trying to build?" The chief's answer was simple and direct. The same assurance your people give mine, that honor matters more than advantage, and that justice serves all people equally." When the testimony ended and deliberations began, Elias knew they had done everything possible to present the truth. Whether that truth would be accepted, and whether acceptance would lead to justice, remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, he felt hope that the future might be built on understanding rather than hatred. 6 months later, the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the high peaks when Elias rode the familiar trail toward his cabin, now accompanied by sounds that would have been unimaginable just a year before. Behind him, pack horses carried supplies and wedding gifts, while ahead of him rode Nahina, her doeskin dress decorated with ribbons and beadwork that marked this as a day of celebration rather than ordinary travel. The tribunal had taken 2 days to reach its verdict, but when it came, justice proved stronger than prejudice. Lieutenant Crenshaw was sentenced to death for treason and conspiracy, while his civilian accomplices faced lengthy prison terms and financial ruin. More importantly, the territorial governor had issued new orders requiring military commanders to consult with tribal leaders before undertaking any operations in disputed territories. The changes had not come easily or without opposition. Black Wolf and his followers had initially rejected the new agreements, staging several raids that threatened to unravel everything that had been accomplished. But Chief Running Bear's patient diplomacy, combined with Captain Hartley's fair enforcement of the new policies, had gradually won over even the most skeptical voices on both sides. Elias's role in these developments had evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined when he first found blood on the trail. Territorial officials had appointed him as an official interpreter and mediator, a position that required him to travel frequently between Apache camps and military posts. It was demanding work that often placed him in dangerous situations. But it was also meaningful work that made him feel useful in ways he hadn't experienced since the war. But the most significant change in his life was riding beside him now, her dark eyes bright with anticipation as they approached the cabin that would soon become their shared home. The relationship between Elias and Nahina had developed slowly, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than passion alone. She had taught him Apache customs and language, while he had shared his knowledge of the white world that was rapidly encroaching on tribal territories. Their marriage ceremony had been conducted according to both Apache and Christian traditions, officiated by Grey Hawk and the post-chaplain working together in a collaboration that would have been impossible before the conspiracy's exposure. Chief Running Bear had given his blessing reluctantly at first, concerned about his daughter's future in a world divided between cultures. But Elias's demonstrated commitment to Apache welfare and his growing reputation as a fair mediator had eventually won the chief's approval. As they crested the final ridge before the cabin, Elias could see smoke rising from the chimney and horses grazing in the meadow below. Captain Hartley had arrived ahead of them, along with Grey Hawk and several other guests who had traveled from both Fort Collins and the Apache camps to celebrate the union. "It looks different," Nahina observed, studying the cabin and its surroundings, with the eye of someone who would soon call this place home. "How so?" Elias asked. "Before it was a place for hiding from the world," she said thoughtfully. "Now it feels like a place where 2 worlds can meet." She was right, Elias realized. The cabin that had once been his retreat from conflict had become something larger, a symbol of possibility, a place where Apache and white visitors could gather around the same fire and share the same hopes for the future. It was still modest and practical, but it had gained a significance that transformed its very nature. They were greeted at the cabin by a gathering that would have been impossible to imagine just months before. Captain Hartley sat beside Grey Hawk, discussing winter weather patterns and their implications for military patrols. Several Apache warriors shared coffee and conversation with army soldiers who had once seen them only as enemies. Children from both cultures played together in the meadow, their laughter creating music that spoke of possibilities their parents were still learning to believe. Chief Running Bear approached Elias as he helped Nahina down from her horse, the older man's weathered face showing the satisfaction of a father who had seen his daughter choose wisely. "You have done well, son-in-law," the chief said formally. "My daughter is strong and happy, and the peace we built together grows stronger each day." "The peace we built together," Elias repeated, emphasizing the collective nature of their achievement. "None of us could have done it alone." As evening fell and the celebration continued around the fire, Elias found himself reflecting on the chain of choices that had led to this moment. His decision to help a wounded stranger had set in motion events that changed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others. The conspiracy that might have led to genocide had been exposed. Corrupt officials had been punished, and a new framework for coexistence was slowly taking shape. But perhaps most importantly, people on both sides were learning that their supposed enemies were not monsters, but human beings with hopes, fears, and dreams, much like their own. Black Wolf had eventually returned to his chief's band, his anger tempered by the pragmatic recognition that the new agreements offered more security than continued warfare. Even some of the soldiers who had initially opposed cooperation with Apache were beginning to see benefits in the reduced tensions and improved communication. The work was far from finished. There would be more misunderstandings, more conflicts, more moments when fear and hatred threatened to overwhelm reason and compassion. But foundations had been laid for something better than the cycle of violence that had dominated the territory for so long. As Nahina settled beside him near the fire, her hand finding his in the darkness, Elias felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with personal happiness and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. He had found his way back from the isolation that had protected him after the war, but more importantly, he had helped others find their way toward a future based on understanding rather than fear. "What are you thinking about?" Nahina asked. Softly. "I'm thinking about choices," he replied, "and how one small choice to help a stranger can change everything." "Was it a small choice?" she asked. "It seemed very large to me." Elias considered this, watching the fire paint shadows and light across the faces of people who had once been enemies and were now becoming friends. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps there were no small choices when it came to matters of life and death, war and peace, hatred and love. But that was a question for philosophers. Tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, and for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing was enough to change the world.